Hey guys, thanks for tuning in once again to another Q&A here on Forgotten Weapons. I'm Ian McCollum. This is a nice smoky Islay Scotch, and these are a whole bunch of questions that I have gotten from some of the awesome folks out there who support Forgotten Weapons on Patreon. Now, as usual, I have gotten way more questions than I was able to answer in a single roughly hour-long video, so I apologize if I didn't get yours in here, but let's jump right into the ones that I did get to. We'll start with James, who says, "G'day, Ian. Would one of the light machine guns, Chatellerault, FNBAR, ZB26, etc., scaled down to a cartridge like 250 Savage have been a useful shoulder-fired weapon for World War II? Strictly speaking, yes, but in every other way, no." So let's dive into that a little bit. First off, what you're talking about is basically a BAR in a lighter cartridge. 250 Savage being necked, a 300 Savage neck down to 25 caliber. We're talking about kind of an intermediate caliber cartridge. So would the intermediate caliber cartridge have been a good thing, all else being equal, for the infantry? Yes, it would have. One of the light machine guns, the idea being this is a select fire rifle, detachable magazines, lots of these sorts of more modern features that were missing from the bolt action rifles typically used by the infantry in World War I. Would those have been good things? Yes, they would have. However, this weapon really would not have fit well into the overall military logistical system of World War I, unless it was the only thing that and it had been in service before the war, and even then there's some questions. See, the thing is, the heavy machine guns were more important, certainly, well, even if they weren't strictly speaking more important, they were considered more important, I think, by most of the major militaries in World War I than the infantry rifles. And it was hard enough supplying ammunition for all of the guns in a single caliber. It would have been a lot harder to try and supply ammunition in World War I in two different calibers for the infantry. And the idea of having 250 Savage for the infantry rifles and then 8 Mauser or 303 British or 30-06 or 54 rimmed for the heavy machine guns, that adds a significant logistical hurdle that no one would really want to use. And you couldn't effectively use the 250 Savage in the machine guns because it just doesn't have the long range capability, the long range ballistics that those full power rifle cartridges did. And they were actually using heavy machine guns at long range in World War I in a way that gets done much less these days. Now, I would say the way to look at this is not so much maybe that all of the armies overlooked this potential of an intermediate rifle cartridge, although that's possible, but consider that what they did instead was look to pistol cartridges and start developing submachine guns. And the submachine gun really was a development of the First World War, doing exactly what I think you're thinking about in this question, James. The idea is, what if we had a select fire capable, much lighter recoiling, magazine fed, high capacity shoulder arm for the infantry? Well, you could make that an intermediate rifle cartridge with, say, 20 round mags, or you could take the next step further and make it a submachine gun like, well, the only one that really saw service in the war was the MP-18, but there were a number of others that were right on the cusp, guns like the Thompson. And so you get all the same benefits, but kind of more so. If a full power rifle cartridge is more powerful than you really need for an infantryman at close quarters, well, an intermediate cartridge arguably is too. And why not just use a pistol cartridge that's already in service, is already in the logistical supply train, and be able to give guys even more controllable firepower with potentially larger magazines and less weight, or being able to carry more ammunition for the same amount of weight. Our second question is from Erica, who says, "Why did stripper clips hang on for so long? Well into the detached box magazine era, production rifles and other infantry weapons had provisions for loading the magazine from above through the action using stripper clips. My personal experience with stripper clips on World War II bolt-action rifles was pretty miserable, as are many people's. Was it less thumb shredding to load a C1 FAL?" The answer is, you were never really, that was never your first option, was, we'll give you one magazine and a whole pile of stripper clips, and when the magazine runs out, you'll reload it through the top. I think the idea, what's much more, your magazines are heavy just by themselves, especially a 308 20 round magazine is a non-trivial amount of weight. That's why we see things like AR-15 magazines being made they were intended to be disposable. They were made out of lightweight aluminum to add the minimum amount of weight possible to get past exactly the issue that you're bringing up here. So when you've got steel 20 round 30 caliber magazines, the idea was you'll get typically 4 of them. 4 was a pretty common standard loadout. Like you got 1 in the gun plus 4 on your web gear. That gives you 100 rounds of ammunition. And any additional ammunition is supplied to you in the form of loose ammo, or rather ammo on stripper clips, in a rucksack. It is, and you save a substantial amount of weight that way, as well as on scale, not a trivial cost worth of making a whole lot more magazines. So if you get in some firefight where you use up all 100 rounds of your generally issued ammo, it's then a lot faster to reload those magazines using stripper clips, either using a little loading tool that you can set on a magazine, or using a stripper clip guide that's built into the gun. And so that's why you tended to see those clip guides built into the gun. It was so that if you run out of magazines, you can top them off, or rather load them from scratch, out of your backup supply of ammunition. And it also makes it easier to load up your magazines when you're not actually fighting. With practice, those stripper clips do get easier to use. They're still a pain, but they're frankly less of a pain than loading everything 1 round at a time, especially when you run the risk of dropping rounds into the dirt or into the mud if you just have this handful of ammunition that you're trying to single load into a magazine. So the solution to this ultimately was, first off, smaller caliber ammunition in 5.56, which allows you to carry more of it for the same amount of weight, and thus presumably you're shooting about the same amount, you're carrying 2 or 3 times as much, you're less likely to run out of all of your issued magazines and have to resupply from a backpack of stripper clips. Secondly, let's make those magazines as lightweight as possible so that we can issue all of the ammunition in magazines instead of having to split it between in heavy mags and in very light stripper clips. Next question is from Garrett, who says, with the proliferation of body armor worldwide, do you expect more militaries to adopt enhanced penetration cartridges like the M855A1 or issue greater quantities of armor-piercing ammunition such as M995? I think this is clearly an issue that militaries are concerned about. Frankly, we'll never really find out if it's a justifiable concern unless some sort of relatively substantial armed conflict between peers does actually break out, where both sides are actually using body armor, or at least one side is using body armor. The fighting that we see today, mostly things like Iraq, Afghanistan in the last couple of decades, there was only one side using body armor. That was the US and the coalition. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for their opponent forces to do anything on a substantial level developing new armor-piercing ammunition, so we don't really find out, was it really an issue? If the US and China get into some sort of large-scale ground war, then we'll sure find out if it's actually important. What's interesting to watch is how armies or how governments are looking at adopting something that will have enhanced armor-piercing capabilities. And there are some governments that are looking back to larger caliber cartridges like the 7.62 NATO. There are some like the US that are looking at ways to enhance the velocity and armor-penetrating capabilities of smaller cartridges like 5.56. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you which of these is going to be the actual successful thing, assuming that we ever have an event that allows us to measure whether any of them were successful overall. So I don't know, but it's interesting to watch it. Next up is from DRD, who says, although hilariously counterfactually and probably impossible, what if when the US was developing the M1 carbine, they adopted an equivalent cartridge to the 5.7 by 28 millimeter? Would probably require a new platform, but would this be as successful as a concept? In theory, perhaps. I think the 5.7 is a little bit too light for the M1 carbine. The M1 carbine is supposed to be like a rifle but smaller, basically, where the guns developed for the 5.7 were supposed to be more like a submachine gun but a little smaller. So I don't see the US looking for something as small as the 5.7, for the M1 carbine back in the 40s. Obviously, we know what they actually looked for. However, this brings up an interesting point that I think I mentioned this actually in our last Q&A as well. There was such a thing as the 5.7 millimeter Johnson Spitfire cartridge, which was 30 carbine necked down to 22 caliber, 5.7 millimeter, and chambered in 22 caliber barreled M1 carbines. And this was something that was done on a commercial basis by Melvin Johnson. And it wasn't super popular, but it was popular enough that people still know about them today, and some of those guns are actually still around. So there was, in fact, a 5.7 millimeter version of the M1 carbine. And it kind of had the same idea as 5.7, which was, let's get a smaller, lighter bullet so that we can get it moving faster. But not really what the US was looking for in World War II. Body armor, as we've just been talking about, wasn't really a thing. They weren't looking for armor penetration. They were looking for more mass on impact. Cody says, excluding Colt and Browning, which firearms designer of the last 150 years do you think is the most underrated or underappreciated, and why? Could be someone big like Mannlicher or someone lesser known like Fedorov. Saying the most underappreciated sets up an a dilemma of, well, there's a lot of subjective judgment that goes into that, but there are a couple, I think, who are definitely underappreciated and underrated. One of those would be Pedersen, who he never really quite hit the big time the way Browning did, but Browning actually described him as the most talented firearms designer he knew, which is quite a remarkable compliment. John Pedersen put together a bunch of really mechanically interesting projects, from, of course, the Pedersen device, converting Springfield rifles into semi-automatic carbines, as well as his Remington Model 51 pistols were a really unique and interesting action. His toggle-locked rifles came really fairly close to becoming the U.S. standard military rifle, which would have made them one of the very first large-scale adopted military semi-auto rifles in the world. So Pedersen had a lot going on. He also had a number of commercial projects that he was responsible for, that he designed, that did reasonably well, although people don't tend to remember him with them. So I actually have a video on a bunch of the different guns that John Pedersen created, and so I'll link to that in the description text here and at the end of the video if you're interested in checking it out. The other one I would bring up would be the guys at Winchester who were responsible for actually turning John Browning's patent ideas into commercially viable guns. Because Browning didn't present Winchester or the other companies that he later worked with, he didn't present them with guns that we would necessarily recognize today. He would come up with a mechanical system, patent it, and then present the company with a license for the patent and usually a couple of his own handmade demo rifles, sort of tool room rifles. And it was then up to the company to turn those guns into something that was actually commercially viable. So picking, not so much maybe the overall cartridge length, but picking what cartridge do we chamber this stuff in? How do we take, say, Browning's 1895 lever action system and actually make people want to buy it? How do we market it? How do we build it, that concept, into a commercially viable rifle? That is not a trivial proposition. And it's something, Browning gets credit for all the guns that were built on his patents when he didn't do all the work involved in them. Now, I don't mean that to disparage Browning's ability even a little tiny bit. He was an absolutely genius firearms designer, and I think without much argument, the greatest firearms designer of all time. But that doesn't mean that there weren't other people who were involved with his designs who put in good and invaluable work on them. Next up is Simon, who says, why do you think it comes that a rotary cannon concept never really took off until the Cold War era, considering it was invented as early as the late 19th century, including an electric one from Mr. Gatling, according to Wikipedia? Yes, in the 1890s, there actually was there were some experiments that the Navy did, hooking a Gatling gun up to an electric motor to make effectively the world's first Vulcan gun. And it worked, by the way. They just didn't find it practical or necessary at the time. And at that time, the only place you could get that sort of electrical generation on a battlefield is when you were on a big ship that had generators on it. They didn't have the batteries or the gasoline generators to take something like an electrically run Gatling gun out onto the infantry field. So why did the rotary cannon concept not take off until the end of the Cold War? Well, first, let's look at where they actually did take off, pun intended, and that would be aircraft guns. Multi-barrel, multi-breech rotary guns have one specific thing that they do better than other machine guns, single-barrel guns, and that is rate of fire. You can only crank the rate of fire on a large caliber single barrel machine gun up so high without having a lot of trouble with parts breakage and bolt velocity and feeding systems and that sort of thing. However, if you have multiple barrels, you have like a free multiplier for your rate of fire. It's interesting if, people will talk about like, you can't run a minigun more than like 6 seconds until it overheats. Well, actually, a minigun overheats at exactly the same rate as a single barrel gun because it's firing 10 times as fast, but it's got 10 barrels in it, or 8 barrels, or whatever layout you've got. You're only actually firing the same number of rounds per minute through each individual barrel as you pretty much would be in a standard single barrel gun. In an aircraft roll, that rate of fire is important because it's in aerial rolls where one or both the target and the shooter are moving very fast and maneuvering around, and you may have only a very limited brief window where the gun is on target and you can actually make a hit. And in that window, you want to put as many bullets on target as you possibly can, whether it's air-to-air combat or an aircraft strafing a ground target. In both cases, one or both airplanes are moving pretty quick. In a ground roll, that level of volume of fire is actually a negative because it uses up ammunition incredibly quickly. If you look at, say, the heavy machine guns of World War I, they could have cranked those things up past 500 or 600 rounds per minute if they wanted to. We know that, in fact, they did. Virtually all of the major belt-fed World War I machine gun designs were, in fact, sped up for use in aircraft. For exactly this reason. They didn't want them to go any faster on the ground because you have to balance ammunition consumption as well as heating, as well as lots of other factors. And 3,000 rounds per minute out of a Vickers gun doesn't actually benefit you when you consider all of the different issues involved. So I think we had a similar issue there as to why the Navy would have experimented with an electrically run Gatling gun in the 1890s. That would be not so much air combat, but a major naval vessel needing to have a way to shoot at a small maneuverable torpedo boat sort of opponent at changing angles and relatively high speed. And you want to hit them as much as possible in the brief window available before they're able to shoot back or maneuver out of range. Now, the other thing that multi-barrel guns do, which is relevant in the black powder era, is they allow you to split the fouling of a black powder high rate of fire cartridge among many barrels. So if you have a 10-barrel Gatling gun, you can fire 600 rounds and only get the fouling from 60 rounds in each of your barrels, which means the gun's going to run longer before it really starts having problems, basically jamming up from being completely full of black powder fouling. That's a relevant issue in the black powder era, but it pretty much goes away when we get to smokeless powder and it's not relevant. So I think that gives a fairly good explanation of why a relatively low rate of fire, or rather a rate of fire equivalent to a smokeless powder single barrel machine gun, which is to say, call it 400 to 800 rounds per minute, maybe 400 to 1,000, why that's what you'll see with guns like the Gatling gun, and why the multi-barrel guns are valuable there. But once we get into smokeless powder, we see rotary multi-barrel guns go away until all of a sudden we need that 3,000 round per minute bursts of fire for aerial combat. Next question, David. If the Burton light machine rifle had been tested in a ground roll, would it have done well? Would there have been real assault rifles earlier if it had been successful? We're kind of retouching on the earlier question here. We really don't know how the Burton would have fared in trials. If you don't know about the Burton, I have a video on it. There's only one known to exist select fire rifle, really pretty interesting rifle that's actually at the Cody Firearms Museum. So I'll link to it also down in the description. You can check out the video I have on the Burton. But we don't know if that thing worked or not. For all we know, it might not have worked at all and would not have been adopted. If it had worked well, it would not, I don't think, have been developed sufficiently and manufactured sufficiently to actually come into use during World War I and been a game changer. It might have pushed, it would be interesting if a rifle like that had done really well, and it might have had the potential to allow us to bypass several decades of full power rifle cartridges in semi-auto rifles. But again, we come back to the issue of its cartridge, which is really an intermediate size cartridge, is not really suitable for heavy machine guns or fixed machine guns in general. So would the Army have wanted to go with a 2 caliber system? Some do, some don't. Next question is from Space Cowboy. I said, what is the oldest and worst firearm you could equip a platoon of troops with, and yet could still manage to be effective with proper training and skill on the modern battlefield? I've had people ask me this before, and I'm going to come back again to the M1 Garand. I think it would be fascinating to see a modern U.S. military squad, platoon, company, you name it, whatever unit size, actually do some real force-on-force training with M1 Garands. I'm sure it'll never happen because why on earth would the Army waste its time in a goofy historical exercise like this? But my suspicion is that modern troops with M1s could hold their own against troops armed with basically anything else. Now, this is starting to maybe not become as true because the everything else team is more and more likely to have optics these days. If you are stuck with iron sights, I think this definitely holds true. I think the most significant factor in relatively recent small arms technology, by which I mean like the last 100, 150 years, is a fully functional, reliable semi-automatic rifle. Anything semi-auto will pretty much beat the tar out of anything that's manually operated. So as long as you've got a semi-auto that is reasonably ergonomic and is reasonably efficient to reload, and the M1 is extremely efficient to reload. I would much rather use an M1 with end-block clips than any of the other Cold War era battle rifles that used 5-round stripper clips. Frankly, I think with a little bit of training, an M1 shooter can keep up the same rate of fire as someone with an M14, and probably with a G3 as well. But that's a little more speculative. Anyway, I think as long as you got a semi-auto that you can keep topped up fairly easily, you can hold your own against troops with any other semi or select fire rifles. So I will go with the M1 Garand, Space Cowboy. Les says, you previously stated that your favorite pistol, like your one go-to pistol, would be a Hudson H9. That was in fact many years ago. Based on the fact that Hudson is no longer available, what would be taken in its place? That's a really interesting question, Les. To be honest, I can't say I'd ever really thought about it. These days, if I'm going to a 2-gun match and I don't have any particular reason to take any particular pistol, I have a Glock 19 with a red dot that tends to be kind of a go-to thing for me. It's not as nice as a Hudson. I can get parts for it, which I can't for the Hudson. Magazines are nice and available, and it just kind of does everything I need it to. I have not spent a lot of time trying to maximize the efficiency of a modern service pistol. Largely because it's not really the sort of thing that I'm most interested in. I'm busy spending my time looking at, obsolete French rifles instead of modern service pistols. But I don't have like a definite, absolute favorite handgun at this point. Maybe a Laugo Alien. We'll see. I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on one of those and doing some shooting with it. Next question is Judge Roy Bean, who says, thoughts on collecting semi-auto rebuilds of machine guns as stand-ins for full auto pieces. I purchased a semi-auto Madsen LMG this past summer. I can see lots of pros and cons in several areas: ammo consumption, belts versus mags, cost, regulation, historical preservation, etc., etc., etc. My thought is a little bit nuanced. I like semi-auto rebuilds of closed bolt machine guns. I generally don't like semi-auto rebuilds of open bolt machine guns. And the reason is all of the open bolt designs on the US commercial market as semi-autos get rebuilt as closed bolt guns. Generally what they'll do is they'll switch it to closed, they'll get rid of the ability to lock the bolt open, and then add an additional either striker or hammer in place of what is typically a fixed or an automatically activated firing pin. They do this for legal compliance, which isn't strictly speaking legally necessary, but it gets done anyway. And the problem I have is that when the gun is designed to be operated from an open bolt, it becomes just a real pain in the butt to operate it from a closed bolt. You'll see this with belt-fed guns. Normally, you lock the bolt open, and then you can let go of the charging handle and the bolt stays open. And then you can open the top cover and do whatever you need to, loading a belt, unloading a belt, clearing a malfunction. Well, when it's been converted to closed bolt firing, you can't hold the bolt open. Now, the whole time you're trying to manipulate something in the gun, you have to hold the bolt open yourself with one of your limited number of hands. And instead of fighting just the mainspring, now you're, generally speaking, fighting the mainspring and a secondary striker spring as well, neither of which were envisioned in the original design of the gun. And they just become, to me, a pain to operate. When you've got closed bolt guns, or to a lesser extent, magazine-fed guns, where you're not really expected to have to use both hands on a belt at any given time, conversions of closed bolt guns are much nicer. Now, all of that being said, I'm not a huge fan of semi-auto converted machine guns because, and I'm a bit spoiled in this regard, I think, having shot a lot of the original machine gun versions, the magic's kind of gone. You know, a good example for me is the VZ61 Scorpion. I really like that gun in full auto, or as a select fire, a little machine pistol, submachine gun thing. In semi-auto, it's just bulky and heavy, and it's not nearly as interesting to me. So like I don't have a semi-auto Scorpion, I don't have a semi-auto Suomi submachine gun, and I don't find them all that interesting. Now, if you haven't had the chance to shoot them in full auto, you don't know what you're missing, and so you're possibly going to be more excited about what you can get, at least by having a semi-auto version, and I understand that. Francisco says, if you were in a Victorian-era 1870s or 1880s battlefield, would you rather have a rolling block or a Martini-Henry as a service rifle, and why? Can you argue the pros and cons of each action? Not really. Not really can I argue the pros and cons of each action. To my mind, they are effectively interchangeable from a user point of view. The US opted not to adopt the rolling block because they thought they could save money by converting muzzle loaders into trapdoors, which, as it turns out, as it always turns out, didn't work out the way they thought it would. Honestly, either one would be perfectly effective. I would probably opt for the Martini gives you a little more leverage cranking a case open. The rolling block is probably a little bit faster to operate. The rolling block is cheaper, but does that matter to you as a soldier in the field? No, not really. I think there are equal arguments to be made for either one, and neither of them is a bad choice in any way. Walt says, what semi-auto rifle or rifles, besides the AR, would you recommend most for someone who's looking to get involved in competitive shooting in the same way that you approach the backup gun matches? That is to say, a rifle with more historical value and fun factor than viability in a match environment. A couple things. First off, make sure it's a gun you actually enjoy shooting. Like, if you don't enjoy stripper clip reloading a Mosin, don't take a Mosin to a competitive environment, because it's just not going to be fun. Make sure it is a rifle that you can effectively zero. I can't tell you how many times I see people show up to competitions with difficult to use historical rifles that aren't zeroed. Like, they've deliberately chosen hard mode with the gun, and then on top of it, they didn't zero it. And at that point, just, it's almost to the point of why did you even bother coming because if you sit there for the entire par time of the stage trying to hit the first target, that's not fun. Beyond that, make sure it's a rifle you can get sufficient ammunition for. Common calibers like 5.56 and 308 are nice if you're willing to spend the money either, well, if you have the time to reload or the money to spend on obscure cartridges or more obscure cartridges like 303 or 8mm or 6.5 Japanese. Consider those, but make sure that you can actually get enough ammunition. Make sure you have enough ammunition that you can practice with them if you want it to be fun. And then I would say make sure that the gun is capable of actually running the course of fire that you're looking to take it to, which sounds kind of obvious, but isn't necessarily. There's a lot of competitive shooting that's designed so much around the AR-15 that if you don't have, say, at least a 20-round magazine, or a whole pile of 10-round magazines, the course of fire simply may not be practical for you. There are some rifle and 2-gun and 3-gun competitions like up in Phoenix that I don't bother to go to with historical rifles because they have like 50-round courses of fire, and I'm not doing a 50-round course of fire with a bolt-action rifle. I just can't keep it loaded. Like I couldn't even come close to completing the course of fire. And in a lot of places, because a lot of those rounds are spent on things that are not necessarily challenging, they're just there deliberately to give you a lot of trigger time shooting stuff fast, which you're not going to be doing if you don't have an AR anyway. Unless, of course, you've got one like a cool Cold War era, a Beretta AR-70 or a FAMAS or something like that in the same class as the AR. In terms of volume of fire. So you don't want to go to a 3-gun match that's got a 50-round course of fire and 25% of that is a 400-yard gong that you can't see with your iron sights, and the other 75% are paper targets at 10 yards that you have to double tap with your Lee Enfield. Like, that's just not going to be fun. If you want to shoot that match, get an AR or get something that's like an AR. Get yourself a Semi-L, a G3, a FAL, any of the other interesting historical rifles that are a little more well suited to that style of competition. Hopefully that wasn't all too obvious, but that's honestly what goes into my planning of what gun am I going to take to what particular match. Ready, Fire, Aim, who has that probably in the wrong order, you might want to check on that, says, will you be doing any more World War I battlefield tour guiding when travel resumes? I would like to. So I did a World War I battlefield tour in France a couple years ago now, I think 2 years ago now, where we followed the evolution of World War I from 1914 through 1918, going to sites relevant to each year on succeeding days, and it was about a week-long tour. I had a lot of fun in that, and I would enjoy getting to do that again. The thing that I have to be careful about is that it took a lot of preparation time for me to prepare for, so I wasn't, had some idea what I was talking about. It, of course, took a lot of time to actually do. That was a couple weeks worth of commitment. And it was something that didn't actually contribute really to content here on Forgotten Weapons. So making sure that I have the time available to schedule taking a couple weeks to do something like that's something I have to pay attention to. I think the tour company that I worked with to do that would be interested in having me do one or more again. I've toyed with the idea of doing something on a little bit of a smaller scale that's maybe a little less formal and organized. Like, I would love to go to France and kind of just explore the world of World War I tanks. There is a fantastic French tank museum at Saumur. And we have all the battlefields where tanks first saw use, both the British and the French and the Americans. And I think it'd be interesting to just go and investigate, look at all of those places. Not necessarily something where I'm guiding a tour, but where a bunch of us are going as peers in not already knowing the subject and finding out about it. So maybe something like that. When it comes up, assuming it comes up, of course, the first people to find out will be the folks on Patreon who make Forgotten Weapons possible. And if there's space is left after that, then we'll announce it to the whole world. Nick says, as someone who watches a lot of gun auctions, what's the most surprising big bucks sale that you've ever seen? There have been a couple that I've seen where sometimes, because I do work with the auction companies, I have the opportunity to find out a little bit of behind the scenes info. There was one in particular years ago where it was a Korean War bring back AK, and it sold for $120,000, which was like 3 times what this gun should have gone for by any reasonable measure. And you look at that and you're like, clearly, like, what the heck? Something's wrong. So there was some scam, or someone actually punched an extra 0 on their bid or something. And talking to the guys running the auction, they take anonymity seriously. I don't know any of the names involved in this, but what they told me was, having talked to the bidder and the underbidder, there were 2 guys who both had substantial amounts of money and both very specifically wanted that rifle because of its provenance and backstory, and they wanted it now, and they had the money to not need to wait for another one to come up. And the 2 of them just fought back and forth from like $50,000 up to $120,000 until one of them finally gave up. The funniest part of the thing to me was apparently the guy who was consigning the rifle, when he went to look at the price, or when he got a call from the auction, and in congratulations, I don't remember which one it is, literally fell out of his chair when they told him, or when he found out what it had sold for. So there is stuff like that sometimes. And in my experience, there is usually a good rational story to explain why it happens. In terms of general pricing, the thing that I just don't understand is the massive gap between guns as art and guns as history. So, like, if you look at the machine gun market in the United States, which is, everyone will tell you, like, machine guns are really expensive and they're always going up, and it's a limited supply. The supply is in fact always dwindling. The demand is always increasing, and they're hugely expensive. Well, the reality of the fact is there are not many machine guns that go for more than $50,000, and there are very few that go for more than $100,000. You want a machine gun over $100,000, like, it'll be an FG-42 or something really, really unique and special. Usually something that also has some specific historical provenance beyond just being whatever model of gun it is. Now, I get that for a lot of people, for most people, $100,000 might as well be $100 million. It doesn't make a difference. But when you get to some of like the engraved Henrys, engraved Winchesters, engraved Colt single action army revolvers, that 6-figure price tag just, it's gone. Like, it's in the rear window, and there are engraved guns like that that will periodically sell for over $1 million. And that is a market that I just truly don't understand. To me, those guns just don't have the interest. I get that there's gorgeous workmanship that goes into them, but I don't know the people who buy those guns, and I don't understand the interest. I don't understand the mindset. That's not to say it's a bad one. It's just one that is really quite alien to me. So you will periodically see me cover engraved guns because sometimes the engraving is something that particularly piques my interest or looks cool. But you'll never find me bidding on those things. That's just not my area, and I don't get it. Let's see. Next up, Charles says, instead of using electronic primer detonation like Remington's E-tronics, why aren't electrically controlled sears and hammers more common on small arms? Having a solenoid system controlling the firing of the weapon would allow you to move the trigger away from the rest of the firing group and allow you to retain the best tactile response, i.e. bullpups. Is this a cost concern, or is it a legal thing? I think it is misinformation, or it's a mental thing in several different ways. So I think a lot of companies treat it like it is a legal issue. And this is something that I was concerned about myself, or I thought was a relevant issue. Having talked some to Matt LaRosier at Fudbusters, I'm less convinced of that now. Originally, my thought was an electronic trigger. Basically, ATF's going to say it's easily convertible into a machine gun right off the bat. But that's not quite how that works. But it is how most people and most gun companies think it works. And if you're going to invest a lot of money developing a new rifle, which you would to do a thing like this, you don't really want to do it when you think there's a significant risk that there's like ATF could just look at it and go, no, all your money's gone. Like, nice try, we won't let you do that, so all your development costs are basically just now toast. So even if it doesn't necessarily create a legal issue by having, the idea being, of course, if you've got an electronic trigger, it's not that difficult to just reprogram it to fire full auto, right? So anyway, there's that potential, which maybe isn't as much of a legal thing as people think it is. The other one that is perhaps even more significant is how the market would actually respond to an electrically controlled gun. If you look at the comments in that eTronics video that I did, you'll see a lot of people talking about how they'd never possibly own a gun that has electronic primers because the batteries will die or the electronics won't work. There is a tremendous amount of just native raw conservatism in the firearms buying market about things like that. There's this a community understanding or perception that a gun is supposed to be the thing that just always works. Like, one of our top 3 concerns, if not the top concern about every gun ever, is reliability. Will it work? If it, like, we tolerate very little unreliability in firearms compared to most other stuff, mechanical stuff that we have and work with. Like, your computer screws up a lot compared to a gun, and we're much more tolerant of it in a computer. So the idea that the market, I think, just wouldn't be willing to accept an electrically fired gun no matter how good it actually was, how robust it actually was. It might conceivably be more reliable long-term than a mechanical firing pin, striker, hammer system. But we won't know because everyone will look at it and go, what do you think I am? Some sort of idiot? I don't want to have, like, the government's going to turn off my gun from space with a satellite because it's got an electronic trigger. So forget that. I'll go buy a Glock. We can laugh at that, but there's a lot of that in the gun buying community. And I think there's enough of it that it precludes firearms manufacturers from risking a lot of development money to make something that, frankly, a large percent of their audience is just going to literally laugh at. There may also be one third issue, that being regulation in competition circles. You know, as you say, one of the elements here, you get a really good trigger. Well, I haven't looked into this in depth, so I may be out of place here, but I suspect if you were going to take an electrically fired pistol to a bullseye match, you would very quickly find that they have put in place rules that prohibit electric triggers because they are not a fair playing field with regular triggers. Now, maybe that just means you get new gear divisions, but I don't think that's as significant as the previous 2 reasons, but that's also something to consider. Let's see, next up, Matthew says, Elbonia has lucked into a windfall. They have been given a large stockpile of 9mm Makarov, along with a production line for the same, and they need to hold submachine gun trials. Are there any contenders? There are a couple 9mm Makarov submachine guns. The 2 that immediately come to mind, well, 3 that immediately come to mind are the Stechkin, which is actually a machine pistol, but close enough. The Polish PM63, which is, in my opinion, not a very good gun at all. Certainly one you could sell to Elbonia. Like, you could make some good arguments about compactness and holstering and all this other stuff. In practical matter, I don't think it's a very good gun. And the Bison, the Russian, basically 9mm Makarov chambered AK submachine gun that used helical drums. Now, those helical drums are really the Achilles heel of that gun. But to my mind, if you could make that helical drum work, that would be far and away the coolest 9x18mm submachine gun out there. One of the things that 9x18 has is a relatively short overall length. It's got not just a little bit shorter case than most pistol cartridges, but also a fairly stubby little bullet. And I think that gives you an interesting potential to have even higher ammo density in a helical magazine than you would with 9x19 or really any other mainstream pistol cartridge. So a Bison with stick mags would still be my choice of all the available guns in 9x18, submachine guns, but man, it'd be really tempting to try and get that helical magazine working right. Ian, not me, a different Ian, says, if you could have any two gun designers work on one thing, assuming language is no barrier, what would you have them work on for the most interesting outcome? Now, he was thinking Georg Luger and Paul Mauser could make a pretty cool assault rifle. I'm thinking you want to really like toss a hand grenade into the issue. I'm thinking Tony Neophytou and George Kellgren, or whoever comes up with the stuff that comes out of Kel-Tec, because Kel-Tec does some really interesting guns, but they're not quite refined enough and they don't quite work all the time. Reference our previous discussion about the amount of unreliability that the community tolerates in firearms designs. Tony Neophytou, to my mind, has basically the cynical experience of working in firearms design long enough to understand how to build a gun that's actually reliable. It has to be simple. It has to, how to start at just core principles and, as a very practical matter, make a gun that works. And man, if you could, that's the one thing Kel-Tec needs. They've got some brilliantly creative ideas and they just lack the fine execution on them. And I wonder if Tony Neophytou could bring that level of execution to Kel-Tec. And interestingly, both of these people are still around and still working today. In theory, it could happen. I don't think it will. So yeah, that would be mine. Maybe take one of those Winchester engineers we talked about if Tony's not available, and give Kel-Tec, one of Winchester's 1890s, 1900s design engineers to refine their stuff for actual mass production. Richard says, a fake Singer M1911A1 was recently pulled from an upcoming auction. Members of 1911forum.com said the gun has been a known fake for many years, and some were slamming the company for not being aware of it, or worse, being aware and taking a caveat emptor approach. What's your experience with the diligence with which auctions confirm authenticity? It is a rare auction or auction company that really puts in 100% to actually make sure that nothing fake goes through their halls. For one, the large auction houses tend to do a lot of volume, and they legitimately don't have the opportunity or the incredibly specialized knowledge in every conceivable field to be able to identify anything that might be a well-constructed fake. That said, some of them more than others are absolutely willing to overlook questionable guns in order to put them up on the auction block and get the best money they can for them. It is always, I understand how you framed caveat emptor here, but caveat emptor is always the reality of the situation. You need to know what it is that you're buying, because ultimately nobody is going to look out for it in your collection except you. Now, most guns that we're talking about, this isn't an issue. There aren't fake Sturmgewehrs out there. There are some reproductions. They're easily identifiable as such. You don't get fakes of them. However, when you get guns like a 1911 made by Singer, where it is basically identical to every other one of the millions of 1911s made during World War II, except for the manufacturer's marks and maybe a couple extremely subtle, niche-known deviations from regular machining, that's where you're really asking, and then you take that gun and give it a massively increased value. That's where you're actually asking for fakes to show up. The other places I see them are in military surplus rifles, mostly things like sniper rifles. When I look at Russian sniper versions of the Mosin in large auctions, I virtually never find real ones. They're almost always fake. I don't feel qualified enough on Mauser snipers to film Mauser snipers at an auction house. At least not until I spend a lot more time learning exactly what to look for, because rebuilds and fakes and put-togethers are so prevalent in that area. One thing to certainly look for is auction houses do have a legal responsibility to not lie to you. And so the wording that they use on things may be very relevant. You also pay attention to exactly what they guarantee. Some auction houses will guarantee everything in their description is factually accurate. Some of them will only guarantee that their basic headline is factually accurate. Keep an eye out for, once you start thinking about these and recognize them, you'll never be able to unsee them. But look for like weasel words, like style. This is a Mauser sniper style rifle, because usually that means it's not real. Guns that are estimated a little too low, like if it's a small auction house, sure, maybe they just don't know what they have. But if they've sort of described it right, like if they clearly know it's a Mauser sniper rifle, it's a long rail Mauser sniper, and they've identified some of the markings on it accurately, like it came from this factory and it's this date, but the estimate seems weirdly low, that is a clue that it's not a real gun, probably. That's not to say that that's not to say they won't ever make mistakes. Some of the auction houses will deliberately sell fake snipers, and there's justification for owning those. Like I was able to find a Russian PE sniper that was absolutely a put together gun with a reproduction scope, but it was a really good deal, and I wanted something that would approximate the shooting experience of an actual PE. And frankly, if I found a real PE, I don't know that I'd want to take it out and shoot it for risk of damaging a very rare and very valuable scope, and so I jumped at the chance to buy a fake one. Now, if I sell it, I'm not going to sell it as a real one. I'll sell it as a fake one, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that always happens in auctions or any other sort of online sale. So overall, yeah, some auction houses are better than others. Generally speaking, if it's a really high dollar item and there are really obvious problems with it, guns get pulled. There was one case years ago where there was an engraved gun attributed to some Nazi high official that got pulled out of the auction because someone pointed out that, by the way, that gun with that serial number sold back here like 10 years ago, and it didn't have the engraving back then, and yet now it does. And that becomes a haha, oops, and that we try to memory hole that incident. So this does happen. Always pay attention. You are responsible for knowing what you are buying, and never be so. It's a fine line to walk between being totally paranoid that everything's fake and being blithely naive that everything's legitimate. You have to discover the balance, and where that balance lies depends on what the field is that you're collecting. You know, if you're out there collecting snab semi-autos, you'll probably never run into a fake one. But if you're out there collecting engraved PPKs or Mauser sniper rifles or potentially very rare finish marked guns, you know how difficult it is to get a fake SA stamp to put on something? Not that difficult if it doubles the price of the gun, right? So, all right, moving on. Duncan says, what are your thoughts on the sliding scale of stolen valor? Obviously not the guys who intentionally seek recognitions with ribbons and medals, etc., but the ones who are just into milsurp. I've seen video accusations being thrown at people who are just trying to mind their own business wearing recycled clothes for its utilitarian purpose. As someone who is enthusiastic about milsurp of all kinds, how often do you wear things with flags or insignia from other countries? Do you ever get asked and have to explain that you aren't a veteran and you're just in it for the pockets, like I am? I've had interesting conversations with camo nerds and people asking if I'm a veteran about equally. My biggest fear is people thinking I served when I never did. I don't wear camo out in public all that much. I used to more than I do now, but I can't remember ever getting asked by some random stranger about it. I do, however, wear camo reasonably frequently at shooting competitions because I enjoy pairing the camouflage from a country with the gun from the same country. Some of my camo has flags or name stickers on it, or name tags on them. And frankly, I am not the least bit concerned about that. I have also seen some people commenting that it's stolen valor to wear basically any sort of insignia from anybody that wasn't officially issued to you. And I think that's frankly pedantic nonsense. I'm like, flag patches, meaningless to me. Name patches, meaningless to me. Rank insignia is where it starts to get maybe a little bit of a question. Maybe I'm just fortunate that most of the stuff I have doesn't actually have rank insignia on it. I would definitely not wear awards of any sort that I hadn't actually earned myself. But when it comes like camo with insignia, I think it's far more about the context in which you're wearing it. Like, if you're actually trying to derive some benefit from making it look like you got an award that you did not actually get, that is ethically unsupportable behavior. But if you're in it for the pockets and it happens to have some dude's name on it or even some dude's rank on it, I really don't. I don't get bent out of shape about that. Let's see. Next up, FaZe, who has asked this question more than once, says, and in fact, we had more than one person ask this question this time. For rare and difficult to find guns like your FAMAS, do you worry about parts when shooting them? If you wear out a barrel on a gun like that, would you ever be able to get a replacement? No, I probably wouldn't. But I'm not really worried about wearing out the barrel on any of my guns because I just don't shoot them that much. I'm not even really worried about wearing out the barrels on my ARs, and I shoot them more than anything else in terms of volume of fire. Now, that said, there are some guns that have relatively fragile parts. The FAMAS is a good example. I made sure to have a couple sets of the little spare internals for the bolt, extractor, ejector, ejector spring, that sort of stuff. Now, those are fairly readily available because they were sold, like they were available as little spare part sets. So it wasn't that difficult to get some of those. There are times, if I'm going to shoot a gun a lot and it has a known fragile part, I will try to find a replacement for that part. But it's not something I really go out of my way to be concerned about. Basically, if I can't get a replacement part for a gun, I'm probably not going to be shooting it all that much in the first place because breaking it is problematic. And why, like, I don't need to go put 5,000 rounds of ammo through an RSC or through a Mondragon or anything like that. Fred says, are you aware, and Fred's asked this question before too, I believe, are you aware of any integration of magnets, especially electromagnets, into a locking or delaying system for firearms? It seems like this could be a possible, if expensive and maybe impractical, concept. I have never seen magnets built into a firearm action. Of course, this is different from like an accelerator railgun type of system. I think the biggest reason is magnets work only because of proximity. Like if your locking system is two-part, like your bolt and your breech face are magnetized and they stick together, it takes very little accumulation of fouling or sand or anything else on one of those two surfaces to substantially reduce the attraction between those two parts. Like you get a grain of sand stuck or a half millimeter thick coating of carbon fouling on your bolt face, you may very well fire the thing and discover that, 50% of the locking strength of the gun is now gone. With mechanical firearms, it's typically 100% or 0%. Like it's either in battery or it's not in battery. You can make a mechanical safety to prevent it from firing out a battery. But even if there's a lot of gunk and you really have to force it into battery, once it's in, you're fine and it's safe. With a magnet, you'd have to come up with some sort of like scale to say, okay, this is only safe if it's got 90% of the attractive force going on. And how do you measure that? And even if you can make that work in a safe manner, you're probably going to be cleaning that gun a whole lot because it's going to stop working a whole lot as soon as it gets in any way dirty. Someone also asked about using magnets as a rifling system. That frankly strikes me as really impractical, especially compared to the efficiency we have manufacturing rifled barrels these days. And our last question is from Edward. Edward says, since moving, have you reassembled and installed your Matrix Armory display wall? If yes, are you still happy with it? I am considering getting one. I have. One of the cool things about that wall is it looks like it's just integrated into a building, but it's actually not that difficult to disassemble, and it packs into a relatively small space. The widest part of it are the panels, which are like that wide. So yes, I brought it with me to the new house, and I have installed it. You will periodically see it behind me now in stuff that I do as a live stream because it's set up behind my desk where my computer webcam catches it. I do like it. I like it very much. I think it is absolutely gorgeous. It is by far the best looking of any firearms display system, modular, reconfigurable system that I'm aware of. Most of the other stuff has a very best case industrial, worst case kind of kludged together look to it. The downside is the Matrix wall is more expensive than most, and it is also time consuming to reconfigure. So one of the nice things about Matrix is that you can put guns up in absolutely any orientation, any configuration. It is incredibly customizable, and you can do all sorts of cool stuff. I frankly have done almost nothing cool with it. I just have guns like horizontally laid out. But you can do spirals, you can do angles, all sorts of cool stuff with it. However, the way that you do that is through a wide assortment of highly adjustable hooks that take a lot longer to put together than your typical sort of pegboard, put in peg, handgun, done. If I wanted to reconfigure that wall, it would probably take me half a day to do so. And it's really not well suited to, I have put my Berthier collection on the Matrix wall, and I found a new one that needs to go in the middle. Give me half a day to reconfigure the whole wall so that I can add that one new gun into the middle. So I use it for a layout that I don't plan on changing very often, if ever. But within those limitations, it looks great. It's a really cool way to display a static set of guns. That shouldn't be construed to mean that it's hard to get guns on and off the wall. It's not, just grab it off the wall. So certainly there's no reason not to put stuff on there that you're commonly going to take to the range. Just don't plan to, if you're the sort of person who likes rearranging it so it has a different look to it every week, Matrix is not the solution for you. So that is another month worth of questions. A big thank you to everyone who submitted questions. There were way more of you, as always, than I was able to actually get to. If you thought you submitted a pretty darn good question and I didn't answer it, please do ask it again. Next month, if you're not in Patreon and you would like to ask a question for a monthly Q&A, I have a sign up for Patreon down in the description text of the video. It is Patreon that makes sure that Forgotten Weapons is here every day, except Sundays now, for you guys. So thanks a lot for your support. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.